Well, last week, the US House of Representatives approved a critical amendment in favor of India, the amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, by an overwhelming majority. The amendment, which was authored and moved by Indian origin US Congressman Khanna, gives India a special waiver to counter US sanctions that are imposed on any country that purchases defense equipment from Russia. The amendment flags the threat posed by China to India's security and calls for deepening US-India defense ties. The Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA, has been a sticking point in India-US ties after India purchased the S-400 missile defense system from Moscow. Well, joining us on NDTV this evening live from the United States is Congressman Khanna. He's also the Vice Chair of the India Caucus. Thank you very much, Congressman, for joining us on NDTV today. Can I first ask you how this amendment actually came about? As you yourself have said, we haven't really seen something this momentous regarding India in the US House since the civil nuclear deal.
Well, I talked to both the White House and colleagues about how we strengthen the US-India partnership. It has never been more critical, given some of China's expansionist tendencies, given the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And there was an appetite to say, okay, we need to strengthen it. And then I consulted with the former defense secretary, secretaries of state, foreign policies experts, and they all said that the critical thing is to show that we aren't going to have these sanctions on CAATSA on India. We need to give a waiver, and we need to strengthen the defense cooperation between our two countries.
Now, ultimately, of course, the decision to actually waive these sanctions rests with the president. Therefore, how does it help? How does this amendment actually help in that process?
Well, there are over 300 now members of Congress who said to the president that he should waive it, and that gives him a lot of support to take that decision. And this wouldn't have passed without the White House be looking at it favorably. It would be as if there were 300 or a vast majority of the parliaments in India supporting something. It would give the prime minister the ability to do it. In our system, if Congress is this supportive, the president is going to feel confident in waiving those sanctions.
You've also been quoted as saying that some people in the Progressive Caucus were lobbying against this amendment being ruled because of their concerns with India. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, most people in the Congress recognize the strategic importance of the U.S.-India relationship. There are some who don't, but they were obviously in a small minority. Obviously, I believe in the strong ties between the two countries on principles of liberal democracy and pluralism. There are places that anytime allies will disagree. But the important thing is that when we have our disagreements, we still need to be taking steps to strengthen the overall relationship.
However, those liberal democratic credentials of India are coming under increasing scrutiny, aren't they? Even in the United States, whether it is on religious freedom, the way minorities are treated. We've seen that even in reports that have come out of the United States. How do you address that criticism?
Well, I believe the way Secretary Blinken is, which is to say that human rights and pluralism is always going to be a fundamental American value, and that will always be part of our bilateral conversation. And it is a fundamental value in India. Look, my grandfather, Amarnath Vidyalankar, spent years with Lala Lajpat Rai as his aide, and then spent 4 years in the Indian freedom movement, and then was part of the first Indian parliament. And he was influenced deeply by Gandhi and Nehru, and those were principles that the founders of India believed in. And so I think that there are true principles to both America and India.
How important, and you mentioned the context of China, but given the sort of standoff India and China have currently at the border, how would this amendment, and if it actually, that sanctions waiver does actually happen, how would this help India?
Well, it would help by allowing more defense ties with the United States. The United States is the best defense in the world. We've seen the failure of some of the Russian defense in the war in Ukraine. The F-35, F-22 are much better than the Su-57. And the amendment basically allows for more defense cooperation between the United States and India on high technology and more United States sales to India. I also am working with colleagues to make sure that India is part of NATO +6. Right now, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, Israel, in addition to NATO, have special export relationship with American defense. India should be part of that group.
Finally, Congressman, India's stand on Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict has really been at odds with the West and the US in particular. And we, in fact, had the unprecedented moment where President Biden described India's stand as shaky. We've come a long way since then. But how did that impact the relationship, if at all?
I was critical of India abstaining in the United Nations. I mean, Putin is massacring people in Ukraine. He's killing women and children. He's committing a human rights violation. India, of all countries, should recognize territorial sovereignty. I mean, look at what's happening in China on India's border, or other threats that India faces on the border. So I would like India to be a strong voice against Putin's invasion in Ukraine. The fact that I have been outspoken about that gave me the credibility to build a coalition to say we can call for India to have a stronger stance against Putin and at the same time recognize that one of the most important strategic relationships in the 21st century is U.S.-India, and we're going to strengthen it. And I got bipartisan support for it. It is the most significant pro-India legislation to pass the Congress in the last 15 years since the U.S. civilian nuclear deal. Well,
Congressman Khanna, thank you very much for joining us on NDTV this evening. Let's see when that sanctions waiver does ultimately come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.